In this screencast, we will cover the topic of carbohydrates, which may be found in Chapter 2 of your textbook. For the remainder of our discussion on chemistry, we will be focusing specifically on biochemistry. Biochemistry is the study of substances that are typically found in living organisms. Some of these substances are inorganic, such as water, and other substances are organic. Organic chemistry is the study of compounds containing carbon and hydrogen. There are 4 categories of organic compounds that we will be focusing on. They include the carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleotides and nucleic acids. The first organic compounds we will discuss are the carbohydrates. Your learning objectives are as follows. Describe the chemical structures of the various types of carbohydrates. List the sources of carbohydrates in the human diet. And describe the functions of carbohydrates in the human body. Describe the 3 monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides that are important to humans. Explain the functions of the various carbohydrates in the human body. And lastly, describe the function of various conjugated carbohydrates. Carbohydrates contain the elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and they contain them in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. For example, C6H12O6 or C5H10O5. Notice that for every carbon, there is an equivalent water, right? 2 hydrogens and an oxygen. And that's where carbohydrates gets its name, hydrate of carbon. Your carbohydrates are your sugars and starches, and the names for our carbohydrates are built from the root word saccharine and often have the suffix -ose. Both mean sugar or sweet. For example, a monosaccharide is a simple sugar, as you will see, and an example of this is glucose, which ends in OSE. Carbohydrates are classified according to their size. The smallest and simplest carbohydrate are the monosaccharides. Mono means 1, and monosaccharides consist of a single ring structure. All carbohydrates are made up of 1 or more monosaccharides. So monosaccharides are the monomers of all carbohydrates. Looking at these structural formulas, if you look on the main backbone of the structure, you will see little bends in the structure, such as here, 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 and here. Although not shown on this structure, at each of those bends there is a carbon. So it's understood that there's a carbon right here, there's a carbon right here, there's a carbon right here, so forth and so on. However, you'll see structures written sort of without actually showing that carbon, because it's sort of understood that you have carbons all along what's called the hydrocarbon chain. Monosaccharides, again, are simple sugars. They're all sweet to the taste, and they consist of single ring structures. So there are the simplest carbohydrates that exist. You are probably aware that monosaccharides are soluble in water. Glucose will dissolve in water, as will fructose. How is it that these substances will dissolve in water despite the fact that they consist of these carbon-carbon and carbon-hydrogen bonds, which are all nonpolar? Well, overall, these monosaccharides are hydrophilic or water-seeking. In other words, they will dissolve in water. And that's because of the many hydroxyl functional groups which are attached to the hydrocarbon backbone. The bonds between oxygen and hydrogen are polar covalent bonds, just like in water, and so we have charged portions of this molecule, therefore making monosaccharides soluble in water. There are three monosaccharides I want you to be familiar with. And the interesting thing about these monosaccharides is they all have the same molecular formula of C6H12O6. 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens. Where they differ is how these various atoms are put together, or their structural formulas are different. Molecules that have the same molecular formula but different structural formula are called isomers. So glucose, galactose, and fructose are isomers of the same formula. These monosaccharides are typically produced by digesting more complex saccharides, which I'll share with you shortly. All carbohydrates that enter the body are eventually converted to glucose. Glucose is blood sugar and one of our monosaccharides. Fructose is a sugar that is found in fruits. That is what gives fruit a sweet taste. And galactose is a monosaccharide that results from the digestion of lactose, which of course is found in milk. So you consume milk, and lactose is a disaccharide, which you'll see shortly. And when it is digested, it releases, or what results from that digestion is the monosaccharide galactose. When a bond is formed between two monosaccharides, we get the formation of a disaccharide. Di meaning two. A disaccharide is also a sugar and is sweet to the taste. There are three disaccharides I want you to be familiar with. The first is sucrose. Sucrose results from the combination of glucose and fructose, and sucrose is that white table sugar that I'm sure you're familiar with. Lactose, as I mentioned earlier, is the sugar that is found in milk. It consists of a glucose molecule and a galactose molecule joined chemically. And lastly, maltose is found in grain products, and it consists of two glucose molecules. If we were to combine many monosaccharides, we would arrive at what's called a polysaccharide. Poly meaning many. And these polysaccharides can be very large and have multiple branches as shown here. There are three polysaccharides that have relevance to the human body that I want you to be familiar with. They are glycogen, starch, and cellulose. Starch is the form in which plants store glucose. It is the only significant digestible polysaccharide in the human diet. Animals, such as humans, store glucose in the form of glycogen. I often refer to glycogen as an animal's starch because plants store glucose as starch, animals store glucose as glycogen. So when we are consuming a meal or shortly afterward, our blood receives more carbohydrate than we need at that time. And that carbohydrate is eventually converted to glucose. That glucose can then be stored in the liver, muscles, brain, uterus, vagina, other cells and organs until it is needed. When we're between meals and not so much carbohydrate is being consumed and absorbed, then that glycogen can be broken down and released. Muscles store glycogen for their own needs. The uterus of one that is pregnant breaks down glycogen to nourish the embryo. The liver breaks down glycogen to release glucose into the blood to maintain blood sugar levels between meals. The last polysaccharide is cellulose. There's significant cellulose found in plants. If you're familiar with plants, every plant cell has a cell wall composed of cellulose. And cellulose does not break down easily. It's the most abundant organic molecule found on the earth. Think of a tree that died 5 years ago, but yet the stump is still there or the tree trunk is still there. Most of that is composed of cellulose. Grass clippings after they've turned brown, but again, just sort of sit there on the ground, that's cellulose. Dead plants, for the most part, what you're looking at, those brown dead plants, what you're mostly looking at there is cellulose. Humans do not have the enzymes for breaking down cellulose, so we cannot digest it. So cellulose is a very good source of fiber in the human diet. So now that you know what carbohydrates are, let's talk about how carbohydrates are used in the human body. So as I mentioned, any carbohydrate that is ingested and digested and absorbed into the blood is eventually converted to glucose. Glucose, for the most part, is used as a source of energy. Glucose is oxidized to make ATP, which is then used to transfer energy for cellular functions. So carbohydrates, for the most part, are used exclusively as a source of energy. While almost all the carbohydrate that is ingested, digested, and absorbed is used for the production of energy, a small amount is actually incorporated into our cells and tissues. Carbohydrate may be conjugated or covalently bound to lipids and proteins. So this figure here, which is similar to a figure in your book, shows the plasma or cell membrane of a typical cell. The purple structures you see here are proteins, and what you see here is like a little head and two little tails. These are what are called phospholipids. At this point, just understand that they are a lipid. The carbohydrate component or moiety is shown as in green here. You can see the little individual monosaccharides that have been bound together. Anyway, a glycolipid is where a carbohydrate component is covalently bound to one of these lipids, forming a glycolipid. And a glycoprotein results when a carbohydrate is covalently bound to a protein. These glycolipids and glycoproteins have many functions, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. What I want you to understand here is that while almost all the carbohydrate that we consume is used to make energy, a small amount is actually incorporated into our cells and tissues. There are also other conjugations between carbohydrate and protein. In the previous examples where we discussed glycolipids and glycoproteins, the carbohydrate component was minor. There are these substances called proteoglycans or mucopolysaccharides where the carbohydrate component is significant. These proteoglycans and mucopolysaccharides are major components of extracellular structures. Those are structures that are outside the cells, between the cells. They tend to be gelatinous materials which hold cells and tissues together. Sometimes they form gelatinous fillers in, say, the umbilical cord or the humors of the eye. They're often found in joints to provide lubrication as well, or are responsible for some of the properties of cartilage. Now that you understand what carbohydrates are and the functional roles they play in the human body, before we conclude, let's mention where in our diet we get carbohydrates. We get very little carbohydrate from the meat that we consume. There's a little, but the majority of it comes from plants. When you think of breads, which are mainly carbohydrate, they're composed of wheat and other grains. Of course, we use quite a bit of potato starch. Think of potato chips, French fries, etc. Our sucrose or table sugar comes from sugar cane, or in the Midwest, sometimes sugar beets. Now let's review the objectives of the screencast. Describe the chemical structures of the various types of carbohydrates. List the sources of carbohydrates in the human diet. Describe the functions of carbohydrates in the human body. Describe the three monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides that are important to humans. Explain the function of the various carbohydrates in the human body, and describe the function of various conjugated carbohydrates.